Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not quite sure if I'm double projecting here because I've got two microphones on, but my name is Kate O'Regan. I'm the director of the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights, and an enormously warm, unfortunately grey and cloudy, but nevertheless enormously warm welcome to Oxford, to the Bonavera Institute, and of course to the Price Media Moot Global Finals for 2019. I don't know how many of you are repeat players. How many of you have been here in previous years? Do you want to just give us a show of hands? Great. Well, welcome back. We're glad that you liked us enough to come back, and you're obviously good enough to come back, so congratulations on that. And to all of those who are here for the first time, a very warm welcome. I'm going to start out by introducing the eponymous Monroe Price, who's sitting here at the front, former chair here at the University of Oxford, decamped to across the other side of the Atlantic Ocean probably 15 years ago, Monroe, was it 20 years ago? 1990s. And he was involved in the establishment of the program here for comparative media law and policy, which was where the Moot was hosted for the first 20 years of its life, or 15 years of its life. And a couple of years ago, once the Bonavera Institute was opened, the Price Media Moot came to be hosted by the Bonavera Institute, and we are really delighted. We're delighted for several reasons. One is that, as myself, as a former judge, a former practitioner, I think there is no better way to learn about how to be a lawyer than to do it in moot court. The process of trying to assimilate a complex set of facts, and I hope you'll find that the facts here were complex enough to challenge your ability, to legal principles is really what we do as lawyers on a daily basis. And mooting teaches you that like no other way of learning the law. But secondly, we really believe in this particular moot because the process or the project of communication, freedom of speech, and media lies at the heart of all our societies. It doesn't matter where you come from. You know that understanding the nature of your society, being able to engage with your colleagues and fellow citizens and people across the globe is fundamentally premised on our ability to communicate on media and on freedom of expression. So it has a very important role in human communities everywhere. And of course, this moot is focused in particular on that aspect of human engagement. You'll know, of course, that, in fact, since the Moot was established, probably the challenges facing comparative media law and freedom of expression have only grown. And in this, our first substantive conversation in the Moot, we're going to start talking about some of the challenges that we're facing as a global community in relation to comparative media law and policy. For those of you who are coming in late, there are seats at the front, and I promise you there's no audience participation. Nobody's going to require you to do anything if you sit at the front. So please do feel free to come sit at the front if you can't find seats up there. There are also a few seats up along the side, and some more seats down the side here. So please do come in and make yourself at home. So then, to return to the Moot, during the course of the Moot this week, you're obviously going to be very engaged with your arguments, particularly Tuesday and Wednesday are going to be very challenging. But we want to start the Moot with a substantive program, as we're going to do it today, to remind you that it's not only your arguments you should know well, but to hope that the Moot will make you think big about the policy questions that underlie the area of comparative media law and policy. And so the Moot has always been committed to ensuring that mooters who come here not only put their arguments and engage in the Moot itself, but are also exposed to some of the big questions around comparative media law and policy. And I'm delighted that for the first time this year, we're going to have the annual media law lecture on Wednesday evening, which will be just before the announcement of the teams going through to the octo-finals and the quarter-finals. And we're doubly delighted that the person who is going to deliver that lecture is Monroe Price, after whom the Moot is named, and we very much look forward to that, Monroe, and we're very honoured and delighted that you accepted our invitation to give it. So I hope you'll all attend on Wednesday evening that lecture. And that lecture will become an annual part of the Moot every year, and it will be published in the Media Law Journal here in the UK, which has a global reach, and which will make sure that the deliberations and conversations that happen here during the finals of the Moot in Oxford every April are actually reproduced in some way in the scholarship in the Media Law Journal. So without any further introductory remarks, I'm going to introduce my colleague Stefan Theil, who's a postdoctoral researcher here at the Bonavera Institute. He has a doctorate from a university which is often referred to here as the Polytechnic of East Anglia, but it has another name, which is the University of Cambridge, which he received about a year ago, and it was on the theme of environmental law and the environmental minimum standards. But since he's been here at the Bonavero, he's been engaging with research that we're undertaking on the questions around social media, some of which Monroe will talk about on Wednesday, but particularly on the question of harmful and hate speech and what is happening around that. So he and I are going to have a very relaxed and open conversation about that. And the idea about that is for you also to be engaged. This is not a presentation where you only get to ask questions at the end. This is one where we would like you to participate and engage. So please feel free. We'll try and draw you into the conversation. We've identified sort of 5 big questions we want to talk about, so you can get a sense of what the order is. That we'll put it up on the screen in a moment. But please feel free to bring the experience from your jurisdiction, from your own life experience, your own countries, as to how we should be thinking about these questions. Because no doubt, one of the great challenges about thinking about how to deal with hate speech online is that there are a lot of countries in the world where these are a problem, but they're not all the same. The contexts are different, and thinking about them requires us to really think globally. And all of us have a bit of a bad habit of actually reasoning from the particular to the general. We think where we come from, once we know the law of our countries and how it works in our countries and the context in our countries, can simply be reproduced in other places. Well, one of the things that I'm sure you're learning in your time here, and I hope over the course of the week you will learn, is that that is not possible. And in an area where we're going to need to look for some thinking around the regulation of social media, and particularly how to deal with hate speech, understanding the experience and context and differences that there are between us is as important as understanding what the similarities are. So this is an opportunity and invitation for you to participate in this conversation that Stefan and I are going to have. Right. So up there on the screen then, you can see that the first question we're going to look at is, what are the issues and problems facing social media, and particularly in relation to hate speech? We're not going to broaden this out to either fake news or to elections. There are lots of other issues around social media we could talk about, but I don't think time is going to make that possible. So we're particularly wanting to think about this in the context of hate speech. Stefan, I mean, what's your thinking here?
Well, I mean, we don't have to really look very far in the news cycles if we want to think about examples of hateful speech, and I do apologize, I have a bit of laryngitis going on. If we want to think of examples of harmful speech being kept up on social media, I mean, the examples are numerous. The most recent one I think that's really made front page news was the Christchurch attacks, obviously, and the video that was live streamed on Facebook, but also the associated everyday pages, everyday profiles, everyday individuals that post content. And then the question, of course, becomes how quickly and how nimbly does social media actually, how capable are they in responding to these problems? Because obviously reports of this content happens fairly quickly. Social media often is informed quite early on about this kind of content, and then how long does it take them to react, and how does the decision-making process work from there? And I think the volume is one of the big issues. Obviously, I think that's the elephant in the room.
I mean, just to remind us, you know, there are Facebook claims 2 billion users. We've never had a scale of communication, you know, that's even vaguely close to this. This is an extraordinary array. There appear to be, or claims that there are more than 3 billion who use some form of social media regularly across the globe. And of course, once something is posted on social media, it is instantaneous. So the scale, the speed are beyond something we've never seen before. And as Stefan has said, with the Christchurch massacre events, one saw very quickly that even once Facebook decided they would take it down, an enormous number of people kept loading it, and of course loading it on websites other than Facebook, very difficult to control that. Are there other examples that people think we should know about of harmful speech from their own jurisdictions, which perhaps haven't made it into the global press the way the Christchurch events did, but which you think are things that you think about when you think about whether we should be worrying about harmful speech online? Yeah. Won't you speak very loud so people can... there's a microphone right behind you. There you go. Great. And do introduce yourself. That's
Prashant Barua. I will be judging. I'm the Supreme Court advocate and media lawyer in Bangladesh. From our example in 2012, there was a escalation responding false and manipulated Facebook page and insulting the Holy Quran by one Buddhist boy. And within 8 to 10 hours, hundreds of old Buddhist temples actually burned into ashes, and many ancient books as well. The problem is the Facebook responded very late, and it was too little, it was too late, and by this time this catastrophe actually we have witnessed. Recently we have seen actually another kind of problem, just falsifying something, and that triggered the escalation, which actually cannot be controlled because of the religious sensitive content and some other content. What governments actually in those areas, including India and Pakistan, their response is actually, the response is not actually driven by what we consider is reasonable, desirable in a democratic society. The term I repeat because sometimes they think, oh, it's over-liberalization, it's over-liberty. So
can I just stop you there? Because I think it's very interesting to hear that, but we're wanting to talk about government responses as the third part of our question. This stage, we're just looking at the kinds of things that people are concerned about in relation to hate speech and harmful speech online.
Distrust. I think nobody is trusting anything. Yeah. Even most authentic information circulated in social media, everyone is, oh yeah, I think it's false. Oh yeah, I need to be double-crossed. Oh, so I believe the lack of trust is the casualty, immediate casualty right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess an additional theme that comes out of that, the further effects of hate speech, right?
Can you hear Stefan at the back?
Can you hear me? Okay.
You can. Good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. The further effects of hate speech down the line, right? Not just in the sense that we might worry about the climate that hate speech creates in general, but we might worry about very direct, violent actions that are the result of this, and that's, of course, a different ballgame altogether. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Munro, did you want to add something there? No. Anybody else who wants to add anything at this stage? Yes, up at the back on the left-hand side there.
Morning. I'm Zoe. I don't need to say where I'm from, right? Do I?
Well, it would be great. So
South Africa.
Oh, excellent.
Yes. So the problem that I feel that has been an issue with social media in South Africa in particular, it's race relations. In respect to hate speech, we've seen a lot of racism. We've had incidences from, there's something called the Clifton Beach incident. It's literally a serious thing. Then we have a guy named Adam who felt like it was okay to post a racist video. So there's just been a generally a large proliferation of racist posts. And yeah, people have been responding in masses. And it's a very divergent responses as well, because you'll have people who will automatically condemn the behavior, and then you have people who are like, no, but they're sorry, they didn't mean to do it. But then again, it's a very sensitive issue, so I feel like it's a very serious problem at the moment.
So I might come back to you in a minute, Zoe, because one of the issues that we'll get to is the fact that at the heart of international human rights law, there is on the one hand the assertion of the right to freedom of speech, and on the other, in Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the duty to prohibit effectively hate speech. And that balance, which is kind of what you're referring to, is a particular challenge. So we may come back to that. But racist speech online is deeply offensive and harmful, and is something that I think besets many societies, including South Africa. Anybody else who's got a burning comment now? Otherwise, we might begin to move on, because I think most of us recognize that it's in a sense, it's the scale and the speed of social media that makes the online harm so particularly worrying, because it does go so far, and it has such an impact. Now, what we're seeing is that as this debate has grown, we're beginning to see responses from different quarters. So in particular, Facebook, of the social media companies, has been one of those that has been most engaged in responding to this. And maybe, Stefan, you might just quickly take us through what they have done sort of over the last 3 to 4 years in responding to this.
So exactly. I think the development has been quite stark, especially like in recent times. I mean, from the first leaked guidelines on the community standards to the initial publication of the community standards. And so we can basically retrace it from March 2015, when Facebook first published the community standards and kind of outlined what it was expecting of users online, to the 20...
And they were quite general, weren't they? They weren't very
not very detailed, very
fine-grained.
broad outlines, in the sense of, we don't permit hate speech, we don't permit terrorist propaganda, but what does in the specific circumstances constitute hate speech and terrorist propaganda? That is, of course, left up very much to the individual content moderator. And for that purpose, Facebook for a very long time already had internal guidelines and, well, basically a set of slides, essentially, that sort of taught their content moderators how to spot the one thing and how to distinguish it from the other. These weren't really published for a very long time. They were leaked on occasion, but we really only got a fuller picture. I think this was the 24th of April, 2018, when they were finally published, and there was a new appeals process that was internal to Facebook initially. Because of the German network enforcement law, which we might get to, which we won't really touch much on, but just as context, Facebook also started publishing a lot more information about how it handles complaints. So a lot of the complaints management system's results are now published in biannual, I think, transparency reports, where Facebook sort of gives us an overview of what it's been doing and under which category does deleted posts or not deleted posts fall. November has also been an important day because Facebook first announced that they were going to get some outside perspectives on their work. So they're looking to put together an independent review panel. I understand they're currently still soliciting information and views from the public on how this should look and how this body should work. And I think we're also going to be putting together a report on this, I think. And finally, March 2019, another in a long series of well, I guess opinions from Mark Zuckerberg, and now finally directly acknowledging the need for state regulations, particularly on 3 areas. But it's quite a change of tone, especially for those of you who've seen the leaked, well, not leaked, but the internal documents that were obtained by Politico on how Facebook has been lobbying the European Commission for a while now to basically not regulate. This is a very stark change of direction, I think. Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of things to note here. One is that of the social media platforms, not all of them have what you might describe as a business model. In other words, not all of them actually make money. Facebook, of course, is one of the social media platforms that does have a very successful business model, and that means that they do have some money to throw at this problem. And in terms, for example, of the online moderation, they now have more than 15,000 moderators globally, a significant number of those working in the German language because of the German legislation, but also the EU Code of Conduct has been very important in that regard. And they're clearly going to have to, the establishment of the independent external review panel is going to involve a significant expenditure as well. And yet, despite all of this, one still sees exasperation and frustration in the public sphere about Facebook's response. I mean, only today, I think, or maybe it was yesterday, it was reported that the Privacy Commissioner in New Zealand, who is a state official who is responsible for dealing with privacy under New Zealand law, expressed and then deleted, actually, from his social media account, some pretty exasperated statements about how Facebook was responding to, in particular, the Christchurch massacre, but also in relation to other things. So although you have seen quite a significant and really rather rapid change in how social media companies are beginning to think about this problem, you're still seeing quite a lot of exasperation. And again, any comments or thoughts or as to these responses? Anybody had any experience of online moderation, had any of their tweets removed or known of tweets that are removed that shouldn't be removed? No? So it is interesting because Facebook is now taking down a very significant number of, not so much tweets, but posts on Facebook. And there are definitely, one of the reasons for the establishment of the independent external body is the great levels of dissatisfaction amongst people who have things removed that they do not think are actually harmful or in breach of community standards. Yes?
I'll try to speak on it.
There you go. We've got two very wide awake microphone people there.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting that Facebook...
won't you just introduce yourself?
Yes,
Sorry,
my name is Sherry. I'm from Germany.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting that Facebook is able to remove content within seconds. For example, when talking about copyrighted music or copyrighted videos and artistry, within 15 seconds, they're able to claim content which is streamed live, but they're not able to remove harmful content as the streaming that happened in New Zealand. So I really understand the dissatisfaction of the people who are saying it should be possible, it is possible for them, and the priority setting isn't really right at the moment.
Yeah. So my understanding is, and there may be people in the room who are more technologically able than I am, is that the way in which the process of posting works is that visual material is very much more easy to identify. In other words, identical material that has been decided is going to be inappropriate content is much more easy to identify as a matter of effectively technology than language. And once a video has been identified as harmful, generally they should be able to remove it, as you say, within seconds, which is one of the things for the copyright protections, you're quite right, which can be quite effectively protected. Much harder with language, and particularly where it varies, because the success in relation to identifying language that is in breach of the community standards is only about 50% using AI, whereas using AI, so in other words, just letting a computer identify already harmful visual material is, is up in the 90%. Small variations can fool the computers, but generally they can get that down quite quickly. Yes?
Okay, let me just try and project. I'm from South Africa.
Hi, Moot.
And I think the very interesting thing that often comes up in South Africa is what is harmful. So I think that's sometimes a challenge in our jurisdiction in particular, and maybe not, and maybe in a number of jurisdictions, what is actually harmful, what is racism, what is sexism. And that's something we debate often. People's things will, a big thing for us for about a year was men are trash, was a big hashtag. And it had a very specific socio-political context. The reason why women were saying that, it was really a movement to deal with sexism and misogyny in our society. But now it's being removed by Facebook as harmful speech. And, those kinds of challenges come up a lot in our jurisdiction. What is actually harmful?
Yeah.
What is protest? What are people's rights in relation to saying things that are important to them in an effort to protest something that's happening?
Yeah, thank you. And that, I agree, there's this line drawing within the area of speech between legitimate speech that we want to protect and hate speech is a hard one upon which I think many of us can agree that reasonable people disagree. In other words, you may take one position and you can see somebody else who's a friend of yours taking another, and you can't say to them, you're unreasonable, you just disagree on the merits. And that makes it especially challenging. When you think of, Stefan's done some work on on what's actually happening in relation to content regulators and the speed with which they have to. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think one of the problems is that I think content moderators itself, especially the frontline tier, I think the numbers vary, but we have like 15,000 roughly, I think, that deal with about 2 billion users. So already you can kind of see there's a bit of a mismatch there. The issue, of course, being that they then have to deal with a very large volume of content being brought to their attention in a very short amount of time. So I think, again, the numbers vary a bit, but I think the average is about up to 30 seconds is the maximum that they will take in order to make a decision on an individual post, probably a lot less than that in practice. On top of that, significant problems with mental health. I think these people are unfortunately exposed to some very, very harmful stuff, and they're not really getting the support that they need on any level. The turnover rate, again, Facebook does not publish information on this, so we can't really know for sure, but the turnover rate, staff turnover rate, seems to be quite high, which means that has implications for how well can you train people, how many people are actually going to be experienced content moderators at any given time at any content moderation facility. Add on top of that the several linguistic and cultural barriers that have already been alluded to, and you quickly run into the problem that 15,000 just probably isn't enough for a community of 12 billion users, and definitely not enough if you're dealing with roughly 2 million, I think this is in the public domain, about 2 million reported content every single day, and 70,000 appeals every month to Facebook's internal appeals process. And so you can quickly see how this becomes overwhelming, which brings us back to volume, obviously, but also says something about where social media, especially the bigger companies, are currently putting their money. And it's clearly not content moderation, or it hasn't been in the past anyway. And that's one of the big exasperations that Kate was referring to when it comes to how Facebook and et al. Have been responding to this. It's not just Facebook, obviously, but it is a quite convenient platform to sort of play some of these things through.
Yeah. And there are also wellness issues. I mean, if you're basically your job is every minute or something, you have to look at some complained of content, which can at times be enormously distressing. This is quite a hard thing to be doing. And I think Facebook is aware of that, but it's one of the reasons why we think it's harmful content is people should be actually viewing this. So Facebook have been looking at building AI methods to identify ways to remove content, but then of course, because we're concerned about free speech issues, we kind of want to know what's going on. One's not enormously comfortable that the process of content removal should become an unscrutinized process of artificial intelligence. So turning then from what Facebook's done, and I think it is fair to say that of all the platforms, Facebook has done the most. Not to say the other platforms aren't doing anything, but it certainly has been, in some ways, the industry leader in trying to think about hate speech. Let's turn to looking at the ways in which states are responding. And we are seeing those responses escalating sort of literally by the week. I mean, just today, the United Kingdom has published a white paper, much kind of awaited white paper, on regulation of social media. It goes beyond hate speech, but it does deal with hate speech and harmful speech. But you've seen Australia in the last week as well, responding in relation, I think, sparked particularly by the Christchurch events. So these things are happening quite fast. Yeah. We're going to talk really only about 5 jurisdictions, but very happy to hear from you and on your jurisdictions as well. And those are the United States, partly because, of course, the United States is the home of many of the social media platforms that we're talking about. And then we thought we would talk a little bit about Germany, which has had this major piece of legislation which came into force last January 2018, the European Code of Conduct, and then we'll touch on Australia, the UK, and anywhere else people would like to talk about. Do you want to talk a little bit about the United States, Stefan?
I might start with Germany, actually, if that's all right. Yeah.
So let me start with the US, and if anybody here from the United States would like to come in, please feel free to do so. So, of course, in the United States, one starts firstly with First Amendment to the United States, that Congress shall make no law which abridges freedom of speech. And it is a very powerful rights-based approach to freedom of speech. It is interesting that it relates particularly to the state sector and does not directly apply to private companies, which is what Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. are. But it's a powerful framework for thinking about speech in the United States. But perhaps more directly of importance in the United States is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically stipulated that social media companies are not publishers in relation to the posts and material that gets posted on their website by their users. So that means that from the point of view of the law of defamation or libel or any other criminal prohibition that affects publishers, the social media companies are outside of that. And that has given many free speech activists think this is core to to the internet, core to the project of social media, because it enables speech, and it means that social media platforms don't have to be concerned about liability in relation to that speech. And although there are some narrow exceptions to that, one of them being the copyright law, which you referred to, the duty upon social media companies when notified to remove anything which is considered to be a breach of copyright, there are relatively few exceptions to that. So that's very much one big model. It is interesting that, a little bit like the First Amendment, it's not a model that has been uniformly adopted in other jurisdictions, although in Europe the e-commerce directive does adopt the same approach, that there should effectively be no duty on social media companies to monitor what is posted on their websites. And that has meant that both the German model and the European Union model has had to work within the framework of the e-commerce directive, which does have similarity to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Do you want to talk a bit about Germany? Because that really has caused the most waves, hasn't it?
I think so, yeah. I think it's definitely gotten a lot of attention. I think that's not always a good thing. I think a lot of the attention that was directed at this law was useful in order to scrutinize what's going on. But at the same time, I think misplaced in other ways. So in a nutshell, essentially what it does is it puts puts a burden on social media companies to put in place a complaints management system that meets certain criteria. Effectively, that means that they need to deal with posts and reported content in a certain way and within a certain time frame. I don't want to give you the rundown of the specifics, but essentially it means that social media is given certain benchmarks, how they need to operate, how they need to deal with complaints when they get them. And it enforces this with quite heavy fines. So there's a possibility of quite heavy fines should social media companies not put in place a management system that lives up to these criteria, to these expectations. The interesting thing, though, is that it's actually not quite as easy as that to find social media companies. So one of the claims that made the rounds in a lot of articles was that if Facebook, for instance, fails to remove a single piece of hate speech, then it will be fined. It's not quite as easy as that. So what needs to happen, there needs to be a systemic problem with the complaints management system that goes beyond, obviously, individual decisions. And if a administration that wants to fine Facebook wants to rely on this specifically, and wants to fine Facebook, they need to go to a court first, get an order that basically clarifies that, yes, the content that you are invoking in order to support your fine was actually illegal content and should have been removed. What's controversial about the law, and I think where the rubber sort of meets the road, is the question of whether this leads to overblocking. Because German law doesn't actually know hate speech as a category, it makes references to German criminal law. And German criminal law is, well, it roughly fits hate speech. In some ways it's broader than hate speech, in other ways it's narrower than hate speech. But let's say it fits what we think of hate speech more or less. That being the case, it is problematic, obviously, because it could entice a platform like Facebook to block too much content. Basically, they would say to themselves, well, we've gotten this report, we're not really sure whether this should be removed or not, but since we have this fine looming in the background, we might as well remove it, because otherwise we're going to get in trouble. That might seem as like a very plausible narrative. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, that has not really come to pass. We haven't really seen that borne out of the data so far. So the transparency reports that have come out have actually shown us that the vast majority of cases in where people made reports under the specialized NetzDG complaint system that is available only in Germany, I think, most of those complaints simply weren't actioned. Most of those complaints were upheld. So basically the content wasn't removed. And Facebook continues to remove most of its content under its own community standards. And in that sense, I think it only removes about 30% or so of reported content. So there's, of course, still the possibility that within this data lurks overblocking and lurks unnecessary removal of content. But given, I think, the propensity of evidence at this point, I think it's too soon to conclude that that is necessarily the case. And so, in that sense, the concerns of many activists, especially internet activists, haven't really been borne out by the evidence. And I say, and I have to add yet, because we don't know. We need to keep an eye on this, obviously. If this escalates, then that is going to affect the constitutionality of the law. But as it stands right now, I would be very reluctant to say that the law, as it stands right now, is illegal, either under German law, under European Union law, and even under the European Convention of Human Rights.
Of course, one of the difficulties with this legislation, which basically requires Facebook to have a complaint system and to take down posts that are perceived to be or found to be in breach of community standards or German criminal law, is that we actually don't know what those posts said. So there's no system under the German legislation for any kind of an audit of what's actually happening. So it's always going to be somewhat anecdotal. Somebody will complain that my post was taken down and I didn't think it was a breach of either German criminal law or a breach of the community standards. But there is no process, no certainly transparent process, whereby we can actually find out what's happening. And although Facebook is for the first time now, and it's not yet actually happened, but it is willing to make some of its data available to social science researchers, and it's set up a system to do that. It's not actually going to relate to this aspect of Facebook's information. So, and Facebook is finding it quite difficult to make its data available because of privacy concerns by users. So there are challenges about trying to work out exactly what's happening there. In some ways, of course, the German model is quite closely related to the EU model as well, isn't it? Which at this stage is not legally binding, but is an agreement that's been entered into between the European Union and I think now 8 of the major social media platforms.
Effectively a very similar approach minus the enforcement mechanisms. So I think that gives us an idea of where the thrust of European regulation is going. I would be very surprised if the EU did something that would fundamentally contravene what is currently being done under NetzDG. So for most intents and purposes, I think that's where the direction of travel is. Whether the EU goes quite as far, I'm not sure, but there's definitely scope for it, and there's definitely discussion about whether it should start putting in place more robust regulation legislation in this level. Yeah.
And then that model, in a sense, which you're seeing in Germany and in the EU, is really requiring the social media platforms themselves to do the complaints management, and it's aimed at compelling them to set up those complaint systems. A completely different kind of model is what we're seeing in Australia, and I think there is talk of it in a range of jurisdictions, which is to set in place criminal prohibitions, both on the poster, somebody who puts up something which is considered to be in breach of either national legislation or potentially community standards, but also direct liability on the social media companies for posts that are put up that are in breach of that. I mean, any thoughts on that as a mechanism of regulation?
It reminds me of the lecture you gave, I think, a while ago on this exact issue. There are 3 basic models that we can think of when we think about how we want to regulate social media. I think the one is always going to be the private law model, and I think to an extent that is what the US has adopted. It is very much about if you have a problem, if somebody has defamed you on Facebook, then by all means take it up with the courts. Like this is basically your individual problem. The other model, I suppose, and this is to an extent what the German European model does, is to draw on criminal law, to say, well, we have, even though we're not necessarily putting criminal law on the forefront, we are definitely drawing on criminal law prohibitions in order to determine what is and what is not acceptable on a platform like this. And I suppose the third model, which we haven't really gotten to yet, but which is the elephant in the room that the United Kingdom is at least proposing now in its white paper, is basically a regulatory body taking care of these things, like a certain way of co-regulation, a public law approach in the widest sense of the term, I would say. Yeah.
Are there models in any of your jurisdictions or new legislation that's either been enacted or promulgated or is in the pipeline that you'd like to tell us about?
Why don't you ask the Russians, Tatiana and Polina? They're 2 participants, coaches, who have seen.
Sorry, Monroe, I'm not hearing you. I'm not sure if everybody else is. Where are the microphones?
Oh, just ask the Russians to volunteer.
Sorry, what did you say?
Tatiana and Polina, so you should ask them.
Okay, all right. Well, you heard your name, and maybe you should get your microphone. Thank you. Thanks, Monroe.
So hi, I'm Tatiana. I'm from Russia. And in Russia, it's really funny because, of course, we have in the criminal code we have an article which will impose liability on a natural person who will disseminate hate speech, but we have nothing regarding the social media platforms or the intermediaries itself. And actually, how they work things out is if they have, so there are 2 basic approaches regarding the social media platform, well, any website actually, any media platform, anything online. They would either block it, restrict the access on the territory of Russian Federation, which is done by service providers, or and they can actually restrict access to almost any content they would like. So they have 6 cases which is named in the law when they can restrict the access to the website, and another approach where if the court says that something is forbidden for dissemination, they will just say that okay, this information needs to be put down, and they would block the website. What I was trying to say is that they never have anything in the law regarding actually the platforms where this information is disseminated, and all they can do is just.
But they just do it anyway.
Yeah, just block it and that's it, and deal with it, and never say anything about actually liability of the platform or anything, because they try to restrict the liability in the civil area, and there are some provisions on that. But regarding the administrative or the criminal liability, they have nothing in the law on that, and this is sort of challenging for businesses. And I think, Paulina, who works in One, will add.
Yes.
Hi, I am Paulina. I am in charge of content moderation policy for second largest classifieds in the world. We remove a lot of content based on requests from Russian regulator, and some of it is it's ridiculous. Like the decisions that the court makes, the quality of law enforcement system in general, at the level of those courts that make the calls, it's a very different reality that really Russia lives in, and no one would even assume that the right to post a listing about the sale of skates or a car actually is an expression of a freedom of speech. It's very, very distinct spheres of regulation. And maybe to breach the... Pardon me?
Just a question. So are there criteria for determining what you would remove? So I mean, either politically suspect or, sexually explicit, or do you have a series of criteria? So what that the courts are applying in determining what should be removed?
Can I put words in Paulina's mouth? Because she said it to me before. It's a model of Russian values. It's a different set of criteria. Maybe she can address that.
A recent example is we had to delete, by request of Roskomnadzor, a listing with socks. Someone was selling socks that had an image of cannabis leaf.
Okay.
Well, that's an interesting opposition to other parts of the world which are thinking cannabis leaves are not illegal to be sold.
Well, to breach Article 17 and Article 19 in Russian intermediary regulation, the government is really interested in cooperating with intermediaries, because you might have heard about anti-terrorist law by Yarovaya that requires all intermediaries to store all data they have about each user for at least a year. And by request of law enforcement authority, that information has to be provided, and blocking is one of potential consequences should you refuse or not have that data. So this is an enormous outsourcing mechanism for monitoring citizens. And in that sense, ISPs are seen as an ally, not always an enemy.
Thank you, that's really interesting, and it is obviously quite a different model to the ones we've been talking about. I can see a hand at the back there, yes.
Antonina Cherevko, International Media Support. I just would like to make a small comment that when we are talking about countries with a very specific regime, like Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, you name it, it's a bit of wasting time to search for criteria, because whatever government wants to remove, they will, and they will then create whatever reasoning, so that, we are all confused about their motives. But the motives, it's like in psychology. You take decisions emotionally, then you rationally explain them. So we have among our Russian partners some who publish relatively controversial things, and they're not blocked. Others who didn't, and they are not only blocked, but expelled from the country. They have to live in exile. So I think it's just...
It's arbitrary. I mean, you're saying it's basically arbitrary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mean, and I don't think this is, necessarily limited to Russia and to countries of the former Soviet Union either. I think there are a whole range of countries which are engaged in blocking material, not necessarily what we would define as harmful speech, but are blocking material that they don't particularly like. What you are seeing is an increasing concern about this amongst governments all over the world, and legislation happening more and more. So, assuming for a minute that you're wanting to think about, well, I want to advise a government who is concerned about freedom of speech and who does believe in political freedom, but what they should do about dealing with hate speech online, and to some extent the South Africans have presaged this, is that it's still quite difficult to know what to do. So we put up on the screen there Article 19 of the ICCPR, which all of you who prepared for the Moot will be very familiar with. You'll probably say it backwards in your sleep, or at least I hope you can. But that's obviously the core international human rights norm protecting freedom of speech. And it talks about holding opinions without interference, the right to freedom of expression, etc. And then if you go over to have a look at the next screen, you'll see Article 20, which is a duty to prohibit. And in some ways, these two really express the challenges, even for states which are committed to freedom of speech. And as I say, I think Zoe and Khomotso talked about that in the South African context, that there's room for reasonable disagreement. People feel that racist speech is very harmful, but it's quite difficult to go around drawing the lines. So that's one challenge, is that the normative framework that we would aspire to have is particularly difficult. But the other is just the sheer scale. So I thought we might finish off by just hearing what people's thinking is about whether it's necessary to be thinking about this at all, whether one should just take a kind of firm view that in fact we shouldn't worry about harmful speech on the internet, that trying to do anything about it is too difficult, or whether people have views as to what we should be doing around managing harmful speech on the internet. Yeah, Zoe.
I personally feel like it is a serious problem. Again, we get different types of people that use social media, and if we take the approach that it's just a non-factor and it's just one of those things, it factors into how we treat things in real life as well. Because if someone were to, if I use the racism example that I used earlier, if someone were to say something to me in like a personal setting and say something racist to me, because they feel like it's acceptable on social media and it's like, okay, it's a non-factor, it shouldn't be a factor now. And again, I feel like people with the growth of social media and how fast it's sort of developed, people feel like it's basically a separate world from the world we live in now. And it's not, because behind that screen, there's an actual person who's reading that thing, who actually feels emotions. Upon seeing the racist comment, I feel something. So it's a different thing. And people act upon social media posts as well. It's not just a thing that you read and then you go past. People do horrendous things to other people, prompted by social media posts. So it's a very difficult thing to say, okay, let's just pretend like it never happened and just move on with our lives. So I feel like it's a very serious thing. Maybe someone, and again, people are different. Other people, you look at it and it's just, oh, okay, someone posted, who cares, it's on social media. Other people, it's like, oh, this is a call to actually do something to someone. Hey, let's go lynch them, let's go burn down their houses, something along the lines of that. So it's very important to actually act on it. I feel like it's also problematic, like how social media is growing, the fact that sometimes the law cannot keep up. There aren't policies in place to actually regulate social media in some countries. I know in South Africa, yes, we do have some legislation, but it's not moving as fast as we would like in order to actually protect people on social media and to prohibit such behavior. So it's problematic. So yeah, that's what I think.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, down here at the front.
Hi, I'm Bahar from Iran. I would like to just add one simple comment to Zoe. We are dealing with different definitions here. We have anonymity on the social media on one hand, and the fact that law cannot keep up. So it kind of make it complicated. If people are being mean to each other on social media, that's one thing. But there are times that somebody is being racist or sexist to a community, a whole community, so that will attract more attention. And when the law cannot react to that in the appropriate time, it can lead to more complex social problems, and it can attract a very universal reaction. So it is important for each country to deal with the appropriate legislation that need to be legislated in order to have the appropriate reaction in case of online harmful speech.
Hello, my name is Valeria. I'm from Ukraine, and in our country, social media platforms are viewed as some kind of form of salvation from sold-out medias on the TV or journals. And in this regard, for example, even presidential election debates will be held on YouTube. So it's like, in some kind of way, it comes to the absurd because everything goes through social media, because social media is transparent and true as opposite to TV channels, and everyone's seen that if they saw it on Facebook, then it probably will be true because someone can say that it is wrong or something like that. And that's why, of course, we don't have any kind of regulation concerning social media platforms, because why would we? And the thing is, I think that because we view the social media platforms as this kind of highest form of freedom of expression, we also forget that it also needs to be regulated, because people treat it as more truth, but however, through the internet, fake news are a lot easier to spend. But also you can't deny the movement and the amount of freedom that social media brought to, especially to our country, and how much it has changed in our country. And in that view, I strongly think that the regulations sometimes they are overboard, because still there is a lot of good that social media can give us, and all of the tendencies tend to focus on all of the bad, harmful content or other things. But on the other hand, for example, I think that in order to educate people, to make them more critical on what they view online, would be a lot more maybe a lot better, in order to show them that you need to be critical when viewing all of the content than just trying to block every fake news, because it is almost impossible sometimes to understand whether it is fake or not, and all of us who participate, and we know how hard it is to say. So I would say that in the end, that social medias are good, but we just need to regulate them a little bit better, but in the end result, not forget how actually good they are. They can be if they can do it right.
Thank you. A very important point. And I think one already can see coming out of the comments how our own context, our own political and historical context, constitute how we think about a lot of these problems. And it's very interesting to see people coming from different parts of the world. I see some comment down here at the front. Yes.
I'm Ahmed. I study in Egypt, and I just wanted to point out that racism and hate speech should not be accepted or tolerated, neither on social media nor in real life or in any other context. However, as humans, we should be able to differentiate between hate speech and racism and each and everyone's political stance and opinions, because this is where Article 19, or the right to freedom of expression, becomes very fundamental and witnessed. If I do not have the ability to be able to speak freely about my ideas and my thoughts and share them with people who might be agreeing or disagreeing with me, showing me other perspectives, their perspectives, or agreeing to mine, then I'm not doing much at all. Furthermore, I wanted to point out that Charlie Chaplin pointed out that humans have a lot of power, and only with unity can we achieve something. So I solemnly believe that social media does indeed unite us at the end of the day. So perhaps I believe that the UK model of the regulation, where there should be an independent body that can regulate the entire system globally, perhaps, which is a step towards globalization maybe, but I think it would serve like a neutral stance. It would make everything the same everywhere around the world, which would have a positive impact on the states around the world and on the people who are able to speak freely and unite as a whole.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw the conversation to a close, but thank you to all of you for really participating and I think giving us a sense of what an interesting group of people we've got in the room and what an interesting set of conversations the next 4 or 5 days is going to see. Wishing you all good luck for the meeting that lies ahead. I hope you enjoy it and I hope that you do well. Unfortunately, there will be one set of winners at the end, but just by being here, you've all done an extraordinary job and you have all succeeded very well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.